In this presentation today, we're going to look at the development of slavery in the British colonies in North America. It's really important that we have a good grasp of this, not only for our exam, but I think given the context of current events happening in America today, it's really helpful for us to have a good grasp of the development of slavery and the policies that were put into place to keep them in these positions. So our learning objectives for our AP exam are these two: explain the causes and effects of slavery in various British colonial regions, and also to explain how enslaved people responded to slavery. So the first thing I want to look at is the development of colonial slavery. I want to give you a little bit of background. So some numbers to think about. There are roughly about 10 million slaves that arrive from 1492 to 1820. The vast majority of them arrive in the century of 1700 to 1800. By the time we start developing the British North American colonies, we will see that slavery is already pretty entrenched in the Caribbean. It was a key part of the economy in the Caribbean, so this is not unique to British North America in any way. The slave trade, unfortunately, was seen as just everyday business. It was part of their economy. There was no real question about the morality of it. It's shocking to think that bargaining over human lives would be a vital part of one's commerce, but it was true and very unfortunate. Europeans saw anyone that was not white as inferior. They would describe them as savages, as heathens. A lot of times we saw the Europeans, especially the British, they would assign qualities to people of darker skin that were really negative qualities, like that they were lazy, they were stupid, they couldn't be trusted. And this is a common trait where dominant people assign ugly traits to the people they control as a way to keep them down. And so these policies were already in place and will be amplified in the colonies. So as we mentioned already when we were talking about colonial Virginia and our Maryland and our other southern colonies, slavery was pretty slow to develop in British North America in the 1600s. It starts to pick up some steam at the very end of the 1600s. Just as a quick review, we know that the development of colonial slavery in the British colonies was pretty slow in the 1600s. Slaves were initially brought in 1619 to Jamestown, but they were very costly, and sometimes people were hesitant to invest that cost with the current high death rate in those early decades. And so instead they focused on using indentured servants, and we know that's going to change. So when we look at the causes for the development and growth of slavery, one of the key constants is that there was a constant need for labor. We know that these are colonies that focus primarily on agricultural products, especially when we think about Virginia and Maryland, and the Chesapeake tobacco is, brown gold, and it required a lot of labor. And that's going to lead planters to look beyond indentured servants eventually and turn to African slaves. The death rate will start to decline, and so planters will see slavery as more profitable in the past. We've mentioned how Bacon's Rebellion comes out of poor white farmers on the frontier in colonial Virginia, a lot of them being former indentured servants that feel frustrated with not only the situation with American Indians on the frontier, but they also have really few economic opportunities. And so there's this disconnect between the wealthy planters and the poor whites on the frontier, and they rise up, and for a little while they're successful before the rebellion falls apart. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, this is a civil war amongst white people, and it scares the wealthy planters in Virginia. And so they realize that they need to start to take some steps to help the poor whites to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, and will also quicken the shift to African slavery as that needed labor force for tobacco. That's pretty important. Another thing that's new that we really haven't talked about is that in the early and mid 1600s in colonial Virginia, there were a lot of conversations about the legality of slavery and could you enslave a fellow Christian? Was slavery permanent? And so by the mid 1600s, Virginia starts to tackle some of these questions, and they start creating laws at the colonial level. For instance, blacks could not intermarry, so they could not marry a white person. They could not serve in militias. In 1662, Virginia is going to declare that if your mother is a slave, you are a slave, regardless of who your father is. And that is going to last up until the Civil War. In 1667, Virginia will decide that it's okay to enslave a fellow Christian, which had previously been forbidden. And that's a pretty big shift, and that allows for the growth of slavery as well. When we talk about the development of slavery in the New World, especially in British North America, we can't forget to mention the Middle Passage. And this was part of the triangular trade that brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the New World. Remember that there are hundreds of thousands of slaves that end up in British North America, but there are even more that end up in the Caribbean, which sometimes you see reference to as the West Indies, and also Brazil. So this is not unique to North America in any way, but the Middle Passage was a crucial part of the triangular trade. And I want to point out something that's kind of interesting as you look at all of these different routes. This commerce, these trading routes, all consist of some type of connection to slavery. So when we think about the Middle Passage and slaves being brought from Africa to the New World, in the New World, whether they're working on a sugar plantation in Barbados, or rice in South Carolina, or tobacco in the Chesapeake, in the New World, all of the goods that are going back to Europe, the vast majority of them in some way are being grown and produced and cultivated by slaves. And then as these raw materials go to Europe, they're being turned into manufactured goods, which are then sold back to the slave societies in Africa and even into the New World. And so they're a crucial part of this. So when we think about the transatlantic trade, which a lot of times we famously call the triangular trade, we need to know the Middle Passage, but I want you to also think about the connection that slavery has in every part of this triangle. I also want us to think about the Middle Passage and the conditions of it. Because the slaves were worth so much, it was in the best interest of the traders to pack these ships full. And many times they were overcrowded. There was barely any space for some taller individuals, especially some of your taller men, to stand. Disease was rampant. About 20% of the passengers will actually die on the journey. These conditions were horrific. And yet the men responsible for the trade, they didn't really think anything about it. There was no desire to try to change these conditions because they were simply being drawn by money. It was common to hear the groans and shrieks of dying people. A lot of times the traders would even throw the deceased slaves over the ship to lessen the cargo. And so this is a pretty horrific part of the journey of slaves coming from Africa to the New World. As part of our standards, we need to be able to analyze both the causes and effects of the development of slavery. The first couple of bullets on this slide are things that we mentioned earlier in this presentation, but you do want to be really comfortable with this information. We see a significant increase in the slave population in the 1700s in British North America as more and more people are moving away from indentured servants. And especially the southern colonies are seeing the benefit of using slave labor in connection to agriculture. We will also see that in areas that are heavily populated by slaves, a lot of times the white communities, especially in the Deep South, were greatly outnumbered. And it led to the creation of slave codes in the New World. The Southerners will borrow from the Caribbean, known as the Barbados Slave Code, and there'll also be the Maryland Slave Code. And although these were slightly different, the main idea is very basic. These were laws and rules that slaves had to live by, and there were punishments if they did not follow them. We will continue to talk about slave codes as the year goes on because they will become harsher. And then also think about slavery throughout the colonies. One thing that many people don't realize is slavery did exist outside the South, but in much smaller numbers. In the Chesapeake, the slaves were going to largely be working on tobacco plantations. This is what we're really going to see tremendous growth in the Chesapeake in the 1700s. In South Carolina, the slave population would have focused primarily on rice and indigo. Although, if you remember, there was a small time period where in South Carolina they were trading American Indian slaves, and that's relatively short term. And then in New England and middle colonies, especially in New England, you saw really the smallest amount of slaves. Their economy was not dependent on slave labor as it is in the South, but you might see them working in the cities, in the port cities in particular, like working on the docks. In the middle colonies, you could see some working in small farms, like maybe a family having one like farmhand. You also could see domestic servants, which is another word for like maids, slave women working in that sense. But I do want to point out that some of our cities in the middle and north New England colonies were hubs of the slave trade. So Newport, Rhode Island, New York City, these are areas that had quite an active slave trade, and although individual families didn't necessarily depend on slavery for their livelihood, these areas were making money off of the international slave trade. We also want to take a minute to investigate how our enslaved population in the Americas adjusted to these horrific conditions. Their life had been upended and totally changed as they are forced to make that journey across the Atlantic. And just like we talked about with the New World before the Europeans arrived, it's really easy to assume that all Africans were the same. And that's not true. You've got many different cultures with different languages and religions. And over time, you see this bond develop between our slave communities. But what is tying them together is the bond of slavery, not necessarily a shared ethnic background. Over time, many of the slaves will be introduced to Christianity, and so they'll start blending their very traditional West African beliefs with elements from Protestant churches. We'll talk later about the First Great Awakening and how both the First and Second Great Awakening introduced Christianity to many slaves. If you, as a slave, lived in a very rural, isolated area where the white population was very, very small, you were more likely to hold on to your traditions longer. This was very common in parts of South Carolina along the coast. And you would see, for instance, the development of the Gullah language, which was a mixture of different words from different languages and really difficult for white Southerners to be able to understand. If slaves lived in cities, like a city like Charleston, South Carolina, they would probably assimilate faster and even have relationships with whites, which led to biracial children. And that's a discussion that we'll kind of have down the road, the impact of that. But it was more common to see in our cities a biracial population that many times could even be free. Within all of these slave communities, family was the most important thing. And then also, our communities will find ways to deal with the hardships. And one of the easy ways to deal with the hardships of life was to use cultural activities. So telling stories, singing. As more and more slaves are introduced to Christianity, they'll focus very heavily on the Old Testament stories where they hear about, Moses leading the Egyptians out of slavery. It'll give them a sense of hope that maybe one day things will get better. So last but not least, we want to look at how slaves reacted to the horrible conditions under slavery, the working conditions, the fear of your family being split up, the constant and ever-present threat of violence. An easy way to resist was to simply pretend to be sick, work very slowly, maybe at night, even destroy equipment. A more obvious example would be running away, but this tended to be more common in your male population. You're not going to see a lot of mothers running away and leaving their children. And then the most extreme would be uprisings. And the most famous colonial uprising was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, where slaves will gather together and essentially try to run away to Spanish Florida, where they believe that they could live freely. And the rebellion ultimately will fail, but it will lead to the deaths of more than 24 whites and roughly about 200 slaves. And some of the slaves weren't even involved in the Stono rebellions, and they were innocent casualties of this. One consistent theme and continuity that we will see from now until kind of mid-fall is that anytime there is a threat of a rebellion or an actual rebellion, it will lead to the whites cracking down on the slave community and making the slave codes a lot stricter. So in a lot of ways, the uprisings make everyday life for slaves a lot harsher than they were before.